G'day everyone, it's Matt and thanks for joining me for another podcast. The Adelaide Grand Prix ran from 1985 and finished with the last race in 1995. Without the Adelaide Grand Prix, the Adelaide Street Circuit probably wouldn't exist. So for this podcast, I caught up with Adrian Mussolino. He runs the Adelaide Grand Prix Facebook page and is also in the process of creating a book to commemorate the Adelaide Grand Prix. We caught up at Victoria Park to record the podcast, and despite there being a COVID testing centre on the main straight, it was still the perfect location to catch up, chat and look back and talk about the Adelaide Grand Prix. I hope you enjoy it. Adrian, thanks for coming along.
Thank you, it's great to be back at Victoria Park.
The last Adelaide Grand Prix was in 1995, so maths never was my strong point. I think 27 years this year.
Yeah, and maths is not my point either, so let's go with that. A long time ago.
Does it feel like that long?
You know, it does. I think when you look at how much Formula One has changed, how much Adelaide has changed, how... The reality with the Adelaide Grand Prix is we didn't have it that long. It was only here 11 years, so it was sort of short, sharp and sweet. And it sort of changed, so Formula One changed so much within those 11 years, but then beyond that, it's grown exponentially to the point that you almost can't really rationalise the idea that it was here. So it does feel a long time ago, and especially when you've seen, you know, like we were saying, the Adelaide 500 come and go and then come back again, and the Motorsport Festival back on, it feels like it's sort of a relic of the past, and it's sort of sad when you hear at Victoria Park and, you know, there's nothing here commemorating the Grand Prix. There's no plaque or museum or, you know, there's a handprints for Ayrton Senna at the chicane, but, you know, that's, you know, it's not really visible unless you sort of stumble across it. So it sort of underscores how it sort of came and went in such a quick period when it's almost just been left. You know, the track layout is all we've really got.
I started the podcast up when we didn't even have any motor racing on the Adelaide Street Circuit, and now within a month, change of government and Adelaide 500's back. The dates for that have been released, which will be early December, and the Adelaide Motorsport Festival week prior has been penciled in as well. How important is it for SA to have motorsport?
It's great because we went from having these two great events to nothing so quickly and at the whim of, you know, political decisions which were questioned at the time. So to have them back is great, and obviously we know the size and scale of the Adelaide 500. It worked for so many years and it's so well attended. And I think the Motorsport Festival is different in the sense that it brings back the history, and it's the sort of, it's almost the living museum for the Adelaide Grand Prix. So I think to have them both together, you know, at the same time of year will work really well, and let's hope, you know, the 2022 versions is the first step to get them back up and running, and then, you know, full steam ahead from 2023, and if they could be combined, even better.
So you've got the book, which is currently a work in progress. I've been lucky enough to have a read through a couple of drafts of a few of the chapters. I guess all of the research from the book, where does all that come from? Mostly
just State Library, looking through the archives of, you know, the Advertiser at the time. I was fortunate to be able to get access to John Bannon's library of his archival material. Obviously, he's no longer with us, sadly. Lots of sort of information. Unfortunately, when the Grand Prix was lost, there was an auction by the Grand Prix office, which subsequently closed, and sort of a lot of material was sold, and you sort of see it in the marketplace at the moment. It pops up and again. Thankfully, some of the archival material went to the State Library, such as a collection of images and slides, which I was able to get access to, and that was a long process to get them digitised because you've got to do it one at a time, and it's obviously, you know, a timely process, but it's mostly research. Obviously, it's not that long ago, but it's pre-internet, so it's not like it's sort of all online. It's sort of all within archives and microfilms and things, so that just slows things down a bit. But you can see there's so much detail and there's so much, and there's so many stories that were untold within the Grand Prix, which is really important to tell.
Yeah. 1980, Alan Jones came Formula One world champion. There was a big push with Bernie Eccleston. He wanted more street circuits to come on board. Having a read through some of the draft of your book, so there was Calder Park, Sandown, Bernie obviously wanting the street circuits. Sydney was thrown in the mix, Queensland, and then you've got us here in sleepy old Adelaide. How did we get it?
It's amazing we got it in the first place because obviously if you think of a major sporting event within Australia, you immediately think Melbourne, Sydney, maybe Queensland. We see Brisbane getting the Olympics. You wouldn't have thought Adelaide, especially at the time, because, if we think of Adelaide as a big country town now, it was definitely that in the early 80s. Really, it all stems from Bill O'Gorman, who was in the travel industry at the time, wrote a letter to John Bannon, and he was around there was going to be celebration for the 150th anniversary of English settlement within South Australia, and there was going to be lots of, events to celebrate that. And he came up with this idea of having a single event in 1986 on a street circuit. It really just snowballed, and then you sort of had Wendy Chapman, who was the mayor, who got behind it, John Bannon got behind it at an early stage, and then, the letter was written sort of in early 83, and then by the end of 83, it's, the wheels are in motion. And the difference with Adelaide was it had that backing from the government and it had the backing from the council, and it was prepared to do a street circuit in the city. Whereas Sydney proposed a street circuit in the city, but it was never viable. It was never sort of a genuine option. Melbourne's preference was more for, the Sandown corridors, permanent circuits. And my favourite quote from Bernie Ecclestone is, if he wanted a sort of permanent circuit, he'd put kangaroos and gum trees in the middle of Brands Hatch and call it the Australian Grand Prix. Whereas he wanted a city, he wanted the backdrop, and Adelaide could provide that. But it was a tough sell. No one had heard of Adelaide. At the first meeting with Bernie, he said, is that a suburb in Sydney? Because just no one had any idea. That's actually where Vern Schuppen, South Australian Le Mans winner, Grand Prix driver, he sort of helped sell Adelaide to Bernie and some of the other Formula 1 personnel. And it went from there, and it was described at the time as a softly approach, and it just sort of gathered momentum and steam where it became really the only option for a Grand Prix in Australia.
Yeah. You said that Bernie had no idea where Adelaide is, so if Bernie didn't know where Adelaide was, probably a lot of people didn't, and that was one of the reasons why they wanted to get the Grand Prix here. Now people say, well, why does somebody spend $1 million a year putting a small sticker on a car? But if you've got a product that you want to put out to market, you go to Formula One, and that's what they did with Adelaide. Even now, all of these years later, people talk about the Adelaide Grand Prix. When we went overseas and we said we're from Adelaide, mind you, we were at Monza, so there was a bit of motorsport around. We said, we're from Adelaide, and we started talking about the Adelaide Grand Prix. So it was put on also as a promotional event to get the word out there that South Australia is open for business.
Yeah, especially with some of the other things that were going on. Obviously, there was a new casino project which opened in 86, and new international airport, international hotels. Adelaide really wasn't prepared for this event, to the point where when it got the Grand Prix and there was this influx of people who wanted to come here, they had to do a home hosting program to get people into beds, because otherwise where were they going to go? So it really did help accelerate that process of opening Adelaide up to, an international market, but also, just for interstate tourism, because obviously lots of people came over from Melbourne and Sydney. So it really did help that process. And, I think we sort of, we from Adelaide can sort of, underplay it a bit. But when you think of how much it's changed since the Grand Prix to now, I think the Grand Prix played an important part. And you're right. There's been nothing since that has put Adelaide on the international map. Maybe the Fringe Festival, but that's, again, very different and very niche. The Grand Prix is like an Olympics, like a World Cup, and it will always be referenced in Formula 1 terms, and that's ultimately what you're paying for.
John Bannon actually went over to the UK, didn't he? One of the little snippets I liked reading the drafts of your book was Bannon went over to the UK to meet with Bernie. So Bernie Ecclestone used to be the head of Formula 1 before it was sold to Liberty Media. Bernie is, from what I've heard, a very tough negotiator.
Yes.
And knows how to get a good deal. When they were leaving after drawing up all of the contracts, Bannon turned around and said, well, there's going to be some TV cameras outside, so let's have a quick chat so we know what we're going to say. And Bernie, paraphrasing, but Bernie said, don't worry, mate, I've got it sorted, just leave it to me. And they went outside and Bernie spoke Bannon up, actually said Bannon's a really tough negotiator. He's got a really good deal for South Australia. And I think probably just from reading that, Bernie knew how good the event would be for SA.
Yeah, absolutely. And it was something very different at the time. Obviously, now we're used to governments, using Grand Prix as a promotional vehicle. So you see, Middle Eastern countries and getting the Grand Prix and them essentially running it themselves. That was something new in the 80s. It tended to be more race promoters and marketers who sort of sold the event without really the approval of the local governments or councils, who really had to sort of put up with it. This was a premier of a state flying over to Burnie to say, I'm selling you this event. And that was totally different. And that's what separated Adelaide from Sydney and Melbourne. So, that's really the point where it legitimises everything, and the deal gets done pretty quickly.
And they were also having a state election very close to the first Grand Prix, weren't they? So if the first Grand Prix fell over, it would really look bad on Bannon.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it was December. So it literally was, he risked his political future on an event which was a risk at the time for Adelaide, because who knew if it would work, who knew if it would be well attended or enjoyed by Formula One. And it because of its success, one of the big reasons he sort of won the election. And actually the night of the election, he does his victory speech wearing a Grand Prix jacket. So it almost underscored this was his event, this was his baby, if you like, and he carried that through really to his political future. Unfortunately, to its sort of sudden demise, which actually contributed to the loss of it.
And the first Grand Prix was supposed to be in 1986, is that right?
Yes, it was supposed to be. The initial suggestion was for a one-off for 86 for the 150th celebrations, and everyone soon worked out that that really wasn't feasible to do all this work for just one event. But then there was all these other things going at the time, and Formula One was really struggling to find an appropriate season finale. There were events in America that were falling over. There was proposals for, a Grand Prix in Rome and New York, which, compared to Adelaide, imagine a Grand Prix in those cities, they just never materialised. So Bernie was desperate, so he said, if you wanted an event, you have to have it for 85, which really, just was an incredible ask of the South Australian organisers, because the deal gets done at the end of 84, and then the proposal is for an event in November 85, so that's a 10-month process really to get it done. And at this stage they had nothing. They didn't even have the laws in place to make the event happen. There was no definitive track layout. There wasn't any bit laid out or any sort of infrastructure purchase. So it's amazing it happened as well as it did, and you would have expected some teething problems, and there were some things that were fixed for future events, but it's incredible that it happened so quickly, and really testament to everyone involved.
I guess one way to look at it is we've got the Adelaide 500 in December, week before Adelaide Motorsport Festival. That's a short time frame to get all of that organised, but we're looking at the track now. Everything's really ready to go. You've obviously got a few other things to bring in to actually build the circuit, but they had that 10-month window to get everything done, and there was nothing. Like you said, there was literally nothing.
No, and if you look at, obviously the track layout is here, that there's sort of curbing and a concrete surface that they can race on. Then there was nothing. So the initial track layout didn't include Victoria Park. So obviously it was going to be down Decateville Terrace and sort of within the city fringes, stretching as far as Hindmarsh Square, but not within Victoria Park. That comes, around sort of December 84, and then sort of the plans are made for the new year to sort of get it going. But what that meant was they had to construct and lay the cement through winter. So that just adds to the complication, and obviously, track breakages and weather delays and all these sort of things. It's a big ask. It's sort of staking so much on such important things, on things like weather and budgets and finances, and would Formula One even turn up? It wasn't the Formula One that we know now. It was the Formula One of cancelled events and things like that. So it is incredible. I think if you look back at the history of the Grand Prix, that really is the most remarkable thing, that it happened so quickly.
And when you said about the track being laid, they laid the track through winter, and they're actually really worried about the track coming up, weren't they, during the race, about the track being pulled up? There are other events where it had happened. I think Spa might have had a bit of breakage that year.
The Belgian Grand Prix had to be cancelled and then rescheduled because the track broke so significantly, and you had, street circuits in America were notorious for track breakages. Sandown in Victoria had a World Endurance Championship event that was plagued by that, so it was a real concern. So, the South Australian organisers really had to work hard to get it right, and there was a lot of testing within, public roads. There was testing at Adelaide International Raceway. They laid a corner with the mixture that they used here at Victoria Park. So all these different things to try and get it right, because there just was no wiggle room at all. It had to be done by, November 85. Otherwise, contracts would be cancelled, and we probably wouldn't be talking about a Grand Prix in Adelaide.
I just want to take you back. You mentioned that the original layout didn't include Victoria Park. I'm guessing the pits would have been down Decateville Terrace?
Yes. So basically in front of, if people who know Adelaide well, Prince Alfred College.
Okay. Yep.
Those ovals there, that would have been the pits, which is hard to fathom. And what's interesting is that original track layout, the crowd figure prediction was so low. It was about sort of 30 to 50,000. And then they realised this is going to be a bigger event than even they planned. So they realised they needed this space within Victoria Park, and that includes, not only for the track to go here, but to house the pits and the support categories and, the concert stage and all that. So if it hadn't been for Victoria Park, it would have been a more American-like street circuit with those 90-degree corners and everything sort of crammed in. Almost what we saw later on with the Gold Coast and the Indy cars. If anyone was at that event, it was very much, you were sort of within the narrow concrete confines of, in between high-rise apartments and things. Victoria Park changes the game really for the Grand Prix, and I think that's where the success comes from, because you can space out, you can, have a good sized pit facility, the crowds can sort of spread through the complex, but then you can have your sort of street circuit type section, and then it opens up, once you get to sort of, Rundle Road, Decateville Terrace, and then back into Victoria Park. So that blend is really the success of the event.
So the pits would have been on the oval where PAC is? Pretty
much, yeah.
And then the track was going to be run through Hindmarsh Square?
Yeah, skirting around Hindmarsh Square, and then lots of sort of 90-degree corners back through the S's in front of the Stag, back onto Rundle Road, down to Decateville Terrace, and then rather than, at the hairpin that we know at the end of Decateville Terrace, rather than turning back into Victoria Park, it would have just kept going into the city. So very different track layout. As I said, it was only, in the relatively later stages of the negotiations and discussions that Victoria Park becomes an option, to the point where, the FIA and the original delegates inspected that non-Victoria Park circuit first. So it was quite late in the day, and again, remarkable to think what would have been if it wasn't for Victoria Park and its use. But obviously, as we now know with the benefit of history, it was a blessing, but then it was a curse, because with that came the restrictions of you couldn't build any permanent facilities and things like that, and each year would have to be sort of, built and then taken down and stored. And, with that comes cost. With that comes, you can't do as many things. Obviously, people have seen what Melbourne's done with a mixed-use facility. That works all year round. Here, it becomes a bit of a process, and it's sort of, the success and failure really comes down to that sort of change of circuit. And it's a tough one. Obviously, it would have changed the game if we had a permanent facility, but I don't think that could have happened.
So there was the track which was going to be using Decateville Terrace for the pits, running through Hindmarsh Square. There was actually an idea that Bill O'Gorman put forward in his original letter, and that was going to be run down War Memorial Drive and over Montefiore Bridge. And
yeah, basically around Adelaide Oval. So again, very different. And it never was feasible, and he's the first to admit that, he was never a track designer. It was simply an idea to have something within the city that could show off the city, and it would have been amazing, not very feasible, but amazing. But the beauty of Victoria Park is you still get that backdrop, and it's actually great because when you look at photos of the event, if you're sort of looking one way, you're seeing hills, and if you're looking other, you're seeing a city, and so it's a perfect sort of space because, it literally is in the city. You can walk there and you leave the circuit at a certain point and you're sort of on Rundle Street, which is sort of where the sort of party heart and soul of the event was. So it sort of has the best of both worlds.
So we've got the Grand Prix. Did they pull everything off? Was the event a huge, huge success?
It was. There was a few teething issues with things like grandstands and sort of, overhead bridges, and, some of the viewing spectator points weren't very good for fans. They couldn't really see the track. But that's to be expected. And apart from that, it worked well, despite, Formula One didn't want to come here because the event before was South Africa, and it was boycotted by a lot of teams and drivers because of, all the political issues going on
with
in
the
South
apartheid.
Africa. Absolutely. Yeah. So it's sort of, they came here, the championships were over, they did not know where this place was, they did not know what to expect, and they were just shocked. Here's a city that actually wants us, that embraces us, and they got the sort of royal treatment from the minute they landed, and there was Grand Prix things everywhere, and it just sort of changed the game. And yeah, it was a great first event. That battle between Keke Rosberg and Ayrton Senna, race long battle. It was a bit of a race of attrition too, and well supported, well attended. There wasn't the amount of support categories or concerts that we sort of would come to expect in future years, but it went off without a hitch, and it was full steam ahead from there.
And you mentioned that the crowd numbers that they were expecting, they ended up getting a lot more people than they were actually expecting, to the point of where the pit building is. Didn't they have to extend up and put another level on there?
Yeah, so basically the idea was that they would have all the VIPs at the back of the main grandstand opposite the pits. But the problem with that is they were selling too many tickets, so they didn't know where to put them, and obviously that you can only build a grandstand so tall. So the idea came about to build a roof on the pits and then have a corporate facility on the top and put the Premier's box and all the VIP corporates on there. And this had never really been done before, and that actually becomes the foundation for what we now know as the Paddock Club, which you see at Grand Prix throughout the world, where you will see the fans on top of the pits, and that's where you sort of your prime ministers and things will go. And that was an Adelaide thing, and actually the sale of those Paddock Club corporate tickets helped actually pay for the Victoria Park build every year, because it just became so profitable to have, and it was a Adelaide characteristic, which continues to the Adelaide 500, to the point where the facility, in its previous guise, was like 3-4 levels, and it was just sort of corporate marquees throughout, and it just worked so well. And little things like that, it was almost like accidents, that they happened, but they happened because there was this motivation and there was this sort of hunger for people to attend the event, and they wanted to experience it, and there was this demand, and it just tickets increased, and they had to find these new ways to get people in, and it just with that sort of need, the necessity becomes, it just fuels it, and it grows from there.
So the first Grand Prix was in the 1980s, and I always say that the Adelaide Grand Prix days were the best days of Formula One, and you had names above the doors where the team owners were taking the risk. It's a lot different to how Formula One is today. Is that also part of the reason why the event was so successful?
I think so. It was such a perfect fit in terms of what Formula One was then, with Adelaide as this laid-back season-ending host, and it was Formula One on the rise, on the cusp of becoming what it is now, but it still had that sort of semi-professional amateurism to it. There was still pre-qualifying, so you'd have teams and drivers who flew out all the way here, and in some cases their weekends were over by the Thursday or Friday morning, which is hard to imagine. But it was great. It was a perfect time because you had those small teams. You had the Minardis and the Jordans and the Brabhams and things like that, and drivers who wouldn't be able to race because they couldn't qualify. Oversubscribed grids and pay drivers and all these things. You had all that, but then on top of that, you had Ayrton Senna, Alan Prost, Nigel Mansell, Nelson Piquet, all these greats. So I think we think of it as golden eras because that's when we grew up, and obviously we attended the events here. But I think even any fan of Formula One would admit that it's a golden period of the sport, and it was just so perfectly fit within the Adelaide era. I mean, I think, take Ayrton Senna, for example. The first Grand Prix in Adelaide is his second season, and then he passes away in the second to last Adelaide Grand Prix season. So, we had him basically for his whole career, and his last win was here. He won. Obviously, he won his 3 championships within those years, and he won twice here. And what a privilege that was for Adelaide to have that. It's sort of, I don't like to speak about luck, but it was fortunate that we got, such a golden era. And I think, as good as Melbourne is, at the moment, it has suffered through some lean years where Formula One wasn't quite, at its strongest. So even though we sort of begrudge the fact that it was only 11 years, it was 11 pretty amazing seasons.
It was a lot different to the sport that we have today. If you broke down in your car, there was no double waved yellow and getting the car off the track. Most of the time, they just left it sitting on the side. And if they needed a pace car or a safety car, it was a case of, whatever Steve-O can wrangle up in the paddock, the old Calibre or, whatever.
Yeah, absolutely.
And off they went.
If you watch the 86 race, at a certain point, a Minardi crashes at the Banana Bend, and they leave it there for the rest of the race. And that's a dangerous corner at the best of times. It wouldn't pass now as a corner, given the speed and where the wall is and all that. And they just left it there. And you watch it now and you just think that's incredible. But you're right, and it worked because it just sort of fit Adelaide as a city, the time, the 80s and 90s, and it was it really was a perfect fit, and I think that's why it works. And you could still run into drivers in the city. You could see them in restaurants and things, and they had their favourite spots and the after parties and things. And being the season-ending event, it was great for that because they all let their hair down. They stayed longer. They went on holiday, within other parts of Australia, and it was all those factors that combined to make it such a great event, which, you're right, it was a golden era for Adelaide, for Formula One, and, what a combination to have.
So obviously being at the end of the year, it was going to be a championship decider. How many of those did we have?
We only had 2 at the end, which is incredible when you think of 11 races and only 2 championship deciders. Japan stole our thunder a few times with all those crashes between Senna and Prost at Suzuka, but if you're going to have 2 championship deciders, you might as well have 2 of the best. And we did with, in 86, Mansell's tyre explosion down the Kettleville Terrace, and that gives the championship to Prost. And then Schumacher and Hill colliding in 94, which gives Schumacher his first championship. And, we said earlier about sort of, what you pay for as an event is you're sort of immortalised in history and will always go down as the scene of Schumacher's first championship win, Ayrton Senna's last Grand Prix win, Niki Lauda's last Grand Prix. All these things happened in Adelaide, and it is remarkable when you think about it. And I was saying this to someone the other day, when we think of the Verstappen-Hamilton championship fight last season in 2021, and in an alternate universe, that's happening in Adelaide. And, imagine the fanfare and the sort of the crowd and what it would have been like to see that happen here. Obviously, time moves forward, and it's in Abu Dhabi, not here for various reasons, which can't be undone, sadly. But that's what we had, and I think it's easy to forget that when we think of it as how far, how long ago it was.
So we had 2 championship deciders. We had the race though for 11 years. So those other years, all of the teams, all of the drivers, everybody rocked up, knowing who was world champion. Like you said, it was just a good opportunity for them. Well, as one of the advertising slogans go, it just brought Adelaide alive. It's just a huge party town.
It did, and that's why, the drivers loved it, because they were in a city that loved them, embraced them, all doors were open, and, they could really have some fun. But, it wasn't a city that was too big, that it was too chaotic. It was sort of still that sort of perfect thing. A great story I love was George Harrison of the Beatles. He came to the first Grand Prix in 85 and is staying at the Hilton in Adelaide. And on the first morning, he was here, before the gates had opened, because he assumed that it was going to take so long to get here. But he literally walked down, across the city, and he's here at the event, within 5 minutes. And that's the sort of thing the drivers love, because it wasn't too hard. It wasn't, too much work. It was just a sort of laid-back atmosphere. And, even though it didn't have the championship deciders, it still had some pretty good races. And, some surprise results too. But it just worked, and it was good racing. It was always a race of attrition. Weather was a bit iffy sometimes. Obviously, we had the rain, the washout of 91, and 89 was very wet too, and that was unfortunate. But you sort of never knew what you were going to get, and that was good.
We're talking just before we started recording about the current regulations now in 2022 with Formula One. Do you reckon if the Formula One came back now, that it would work?
It could. I think, nothing's impossible. It's obviously a very different Formula One, and I think there would need to be a significant safety changes to the Adelaide circuit. Some sections were marginal at the time, and obviously now in a more sort of safety-conscious environment, there would need to be changes. So I don't know if it could run on the original layout for that reason, but, it would be possible. I mean, you look at the Saudi Arabian circuit, for example, that's crazy compared to some of the other tracks. So if they can get away with that, then I can't see why they couldn't here in Adelaide. Obviously, the real debate is around infrastructure and budgets and whether the financials could work, and that's probably a different podcast altogether.
I guess, though, the other question to ask is, should Formula One come back? Should Formula One come back to Adelaide? Or should we just look back, look at what we had, appreciate it, and leave it how it was? If you know what I mean, like, would bringing Formula One back ruin those memories that we had of yesteryear?
Yeah, so I have an opinion that a lot of people don't like, is that we shouldn't get it back and we shouldn't have it. I think the realities are just too far for Adelaide to even contemplate having it. If you look at the Formula One now compared to then, we can't compete against the Middle Eastern countries and, places like, America is going to have 3 Grand Prix soon and things like that. We just can't compete economically and financially to get it here. Melbourne struggles to justify the Grand Prix despite a bigger population and a circuit that's, mostly built with a pit facility that's standing there all the time. It wouldn't work financially, and, we don't want to be in a position where it's a hated event because of, it's not working financially. So I think with those realities, as sad as it is, I think it's best left in history, and therefore we need to be celebrating what we had. And I don't think Adelaide does a good enough job with that. And I've come across this. This is the thing that really opened my eyes when I started this project, was everyone sort of was saying, well, it's a negative because we need to be getting it back. It was lost to us, and it was taken from us and all this sort of stuff. And so we don't want to sort of talk about it or celebrate it or anything like that. But I think if we accept that we're not going to get back, we probably weren't going to keep it long term anyway, because Formula One was always going to outgrow Adelaide. We should just be celebrating what we had, because it was a pretty remarkable thing that happened in the first place and lasted for 11 years and was as successful as it was. If we start from that point, I think we can really start commemorating the event, and I think that's where the Motorsport Festival comes in, and even the Adelaide 500, it has those sort of Grand Prix vibes because it uses the same track. So I think we need to be at that point, and I think if Formula One was still here, it wouldn't have been the same. You can see in Melbourne there's a bit of a fatigue with the event at a time, and we didn't have it for long enough to have that. We did in some cases, but not overwhelming. It was for various reasons why I was lost, which we can discuss another time. But it's almost like it was just a perfect fit for its time, and we should just let it be and celebrate what we had.
Do you think people still hold on to the fact that, we lost the Grand Prix? Do you think a lot of people still have that sort of that bitterness towards?
Yes. Absolutely. And I've seen that firsthand, where I've tried to sell the idea for the book, and a lot of people, probably not motorsport people and not necessarily fans of the Grand Prix, but their attitude to me is, yeah, it's a negative thing because we lost it, so why should we even talk about it?
Like you say, is that one of the ways that we can change it, is accept the fact that it ain't coming back? And
I think so, and I think it needs to almost pass a generation where we're in the generation who experienced it firsthand and then sort of missed it, whereas we need to get to the generation who can't comprehend that there was even a Grand Prix here. So, well, where do I learn more about it? How do I understand how this happened? And I think will take time, and that's where the Motorsport Festival, I think, really comes in handy, because it is that living museum and celebration of the Grand Prix. It will take time. I think it's getting there. I think people just need to accept the realities of, it's a very different Formula One now. I mean, if you look at what Bahrain and Azerbaijan and Abu Dhabi are paying, I don't think Adelaide or South Australian economy has that money full stop, let alone to pay to get the Grand Prix here.
Sure.
So I think that's just the sad reality. And I think, we need to see how Melbourne struggles to pay for it, to see that, a city, 5 times bigger than Adelaide is if they struggle, we probably would. It was perfect for its time because it still was, that Formula One which went to, mostly European countries and then went to Canada, America, Japan and Australia, and that was it. Now it's flipped the other way. So it's the reality, but again, let's not let that stop us from celebrating what we had and those amazing races.
Would more permanent reminders we've got the handprints at the centre chicane, we've got handprints down Hutt Street, but really, if people come from interstate or people come from overseas, or if they're Formula One fans and they're like, oh, well, Adelaide used to be on the map, we're going to Adelaide, let's see what's there. And really, there's nothing. Do you think we need a few more permanent reminders?
I couldn't agree more. That's one of the messages I get the most on the Facebook page is from international tourists pre-COVID and now starting up again, who are coming to Adelaide and say, I love the Grand Prix, I used to love the track, I love following it, I'm coming to Adelaide, where can I see a museum, where can I can I visit the track, is there something at the track? And I have a pre-prepared statement that I just copy and paste because I get it so often. And you're right, it's hardly anything. I mean, the plaques at Victoria Park are for the horse racing facility, which is long gone, and it's a real shame. And I think that's where the motivation for me came with the Facebook page was, well, at least there's somewhere where we can actually celebrate it and go, well, it was on this day that Mansell's tyre exploded or things like that, because otherwise it would be forgotten history. Apart from the Motorsport Festival, there's nothing else. So, and we almost lost that. So there needs to be more done, absolutely, and I hope time can help with that. And it'd be great to come here one day and sort of have a plaque that says, from 85 to 95, there was a Grand Prix here, there was a world record crowd, Senna's last win and all those things, because there's so much to celebrate.
Yeah. We've only just touched the surface. We've spoken about how we got the Adelaide Grand Prix, and we've spoken about the lead up, about there only being 10 months for them to get ready, and they pulled it off. I think we'll need to have a couple more chats in the future. We'll go through some of the great years that we had here in Adelaide, and then also touch on the topic of how we lost it, whether it was stolen or not.
Yes, that's a podcast in itself.
No worries, Adrian. I really appreciate it. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Well, that brings us to the end of another podcast. After reading through a couple of the draft chapters of Adrian's book, I'm really looking forward to it coming out. Check out the Adelaide Grand Prix Facebook page. A lot of the photos that he's come across during his research go up on there, and it is well worth checking out. There's a lot more to discuss regarding the Adelaide Grand Prix, so I'm looking forward to catching up with Adrian soon to record some more podcasts. Did you attend the Adelaide Grand Prix? What were some of your memories of the event? Leave us a comment on the Facebook page or the YouTube channel. Thanks for listening. Bye for now.